Agorism is a form of free market anarchism and is considered an extreme variant of libertarianism.
Today, Filthy Heretic from Back Alley Philosophy
will explain his views in the first live IdeoLogs interview.
How would you define agorism?
Agorism is really more of a praxis rather than a core philosophy. The basic idea solves the question of how do we achieve anarchism from the current status quo of a world dominated by multiple governments. The basic idea is that you achieve anarchism through counter-economic actions to starve the state of tax revenue. Now, what that means is that you produce your own goods and services and you trade that in black and gray markets on a peer-to-peer basis. So, just as an example, when you're a kid, have you ever shoveled driveways as a kid and got paid by the neighbors to do that?
Yes.
That's counter-economic activity because guess what? You didn't pay taxes on that. Just quickly define my terms. When I say black and gray markets, those are terms that were largely coined by Samuel Edward Conklin III. He defined that the economy consists of 5 markets. There's the white market, which is the normal market for goods and services. There's the gray market, which is goods and services that are completely legal, but are provided and traded in ways that aren't completely legal. For example, the shoveling thing I just described, in addition to contract work, like say repairing a house without being properly licensed, that's gray markets. Black markets are goods and services being provided that are perfectly ethical. For example, drugs, alcohol, sex, but that are not legal. So this is illegal trading of illegal goods. Then there is the pink market, which is unethical goods and services like war, like abortion, that are completely legal. And then you have the red market, which is unethical trade in illegal goods like slavery. So now that I got that described, yeah, the basic idea of agorism is to trade in goods and services in such a way that it starves the state of resources. The reason that this is important is because largely the reason that states have been able to become as large as they have is not just because of taxation, but because that taxation is used as the collateral by which governments can continuously borrow money from banks, central banks, and other governments to continuously fund themselves. And when a government is not able to fund themselves, well, it means that they can't pay their employees. It means that there's no legislation enforcement. It means that the various services which they use to basically undermine the people and delegitimize our interests, they're no longer going to be as effective, and they're essentially just going to, fade away. Not quietly, of course. They're going to do everything they can to make sure that they get as much revenue from the people as possible, but at the very least, we have a very clear pathway in a way that is individually profitable for all of its actors to undermine the state as well as provide the goods and services that people are already accustomed to in our current status quo.
So how would you prevent coercive hierarchies or governments from forming within this anarchist society?
Well, why would people want them to? I mean, it's not like these coercive structures formed organically. I mean, are you referring to the Warlords Problem?
Yes.
Well, the Warlords Problem is largely inorganic in the sense that states formed in the first place because basically bandit gangs realized that their predation on the people is only a viable business model if they, 1, cooperated, and 2, allowed their victims to maintain just enough resources so that they could plunder them again in the future. With this in mind, the kind of business model that these bandit gangs operated off of is no longer going to be profitable in a completely decentralized peer-to-peer basis. Because, well, one thing, we have the infrastructure by which finance is now decentralized through cryptocurrency. The way it works is that people are only aware of a financial transaction happening because they're a party, either because they sent cryptocurrency or they received cryptocurrency. It is anonymous, it is protected, and it basically makes it so that any action, whether they call themselves a government or a gang of thugs, is unable to prove that any transaction even actually happened, let alone could even possibly get their hands on it. As such, kind of plunder that states normally are able to do is significantly more difficult. And yeah, governments nowadays are trying their best to try to get their hands on and restrict people's cryptocurrency, but it's ultimately not a thing that they're able to stop. The genie's out of the bottle now, you can't put him back in. The kind of warlords that people are legitimately worried about, don't get me wrong. When a warlord does start to come around, some coercive entity does start to restrict people's economic activities, I mean, it's doing just that. It's restricting people's economic activities. It's a direct antagonist to people's livelihoods and their interests. So naturally, there's going to be an economic demand, not only for themselves, but to potentially hire others, by which they can be defended against this coercive entity.
So, with defense covered, how would the other systems that government currently handles be handled, such as justice and infrastructure?
Infrastructure is extremely simple, simply because that if there is something that needs to be built, it's going to get built. I mean, the highway system was originally being built by a lot of businesses just operating together voluntarily to get this transportation infrastructure that they all wanted. So businesses cooperate and collaborate all the time on big projects. A good example is the Two Rivers Road in Iowa, I believe, which was a 230-mile stretch of road that was built in 1 hour by farmers just going out and just deciding to, yeah, let's build this big ass road. So, I mean, to believe that bridges, highways, and that other infrastructure that actually is useful because we actually have market signals rather than government coercion to determine what is or is not useful, that's going to make sure that the infrastructure not only does get built and that there are economic incentives to do so, but ensures that infrastructure that does get built is actually financially and economically useful. With this in mind, you're asking a question about justice, which, here's a question. How do you get justice?
Setting things back to the way they were before the crime was committed?
That's actually a very good answer. The anarchist, and any principled anarchist, will tell you that justice is an emergent property of a voluntary society. It comes from the bottom up rather than the top-down structure that you would otherwise get from a coercive monopoly. Coercive monopoly, of course, I'm referring to a government. With this in mind, if you are living with a neighbor, it's going to be in your interest to, not be shooting at the neighbor, because otherwise they'll probably be shooting at you or otherwise doing things that hurt you, damage your property, and do all sorts of things that generally are going to harm you. As such, you have a mutual interest in, if not cooperation, then at least peaceful coexistence. I don't think that's controversial, is it?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah. So with this in mind, we already have a very, very basic and rudimentary idea of justice. I don't screw with you, you don't screw with me. We're both okay. And as such, well, you're going to have, in any society, without question, you're going to have conflicts of interest. You're going to have people with mutually exclusive ideas and what they want. So the question then becomes, how do we resolve this? On the question of who gets what scarce resources, we have, of course, property rights. People are going to want to have certain things that are theirs, and if they want to maintain what is theirs, they're going to want to respect what other people also claim to be theirs as well. As such, we get the basic idea of property rights. In addition to this, you have questions of right and wrong. Like suppose, for example, some woman goes to a private court and says, this man raped me. And the man is brought in and says, yes, I raped her, but she tried to fight me off. She should owe me reparations. So how do you determine who is right and wrong? I can go into deontological ethics and how that works, but the basic idea, just for brevity's sake, is that questions of right and wrong are knowable and they are discoverable through people trying to figure out an objective way of determining right and wrong. And they will, of course, come to the conclusion of deontological ethics and figure out that, yeah, the non-aggression principle is accurate, that the burden of proof is on the person making a positive claim rather than a negative claim, and that property rights cannot be violated legitimately on the basis of self-ownership. With this in mind, any court that's going to be worth their salt, their business model is dependent on their reputation. They're going to want to be as objective and unbiased as possible. So this is how you're going to avoid problems like rich people just paying off courts. Because, I mean, sure, they can do that in the short term, but because we have an effective free market of justice, they're going to be bought out by courts that are ethical and legitimate. How do you meet everybody's individual interests? Now, obviously, the government is not able to do these things. I mean, the existence of political parties strongly implies certain marginal preferences that individuals have that are not currently being met by the status quo. Maybe they dislike having some other thing. Maybe they perceive some consequence of current policy, both legitimate and illegitimate, that either directly affects them right now is going to affect them in the future or has affected them, but they otherwise believe that they would be better off if they didn't have this burden put upon them. The thing is that a government can only meet a certain set of marginal preferences status quo at any particular time, depending on who is in power. With this in mind, how do you meet everybody's marginal preferences? So you're going to have, of course, I don't want to say capitalists, but I would say like pro-market people who are going to want to have markets. You're going to have mutualists who want mutual aid societies and worker co-ops. And you're also going to have communists who are going to want to have their, little communes and their collectively owned societies. Any principled agorist would recognize that you can actually have all of these parallel societies existing simultaneously and peacefully within each other. The communists can live among themselves, the mutualists can live in mutualists, and the marketers have the market. I personally am a marketeer, but I of course recognize that communism and mutualism, those things are perfectly compatible with very voluntarist ideas. As long as they're not aggressing against us and we're not aggressing against them, it's perfectly okay. As long as all participants voluntarily consent, it's no concern of mine.
That makes sense. So do you have any closing thoughts or anything you'd like to mention?
There is one other thing I think I should cover, and that is the question of why I am an anarchist. The question, I think I mentioned the burden of proof before, actually, but it didn't really go into detail. The basic idea is very similar to what we already have in statist justice of innocent until proven guilty. The basic idea is that the burden of proof is on the state to demonstrate that the person accused of the crime did commit it. With this in mind, it's the same thing with the burden of proof, or with the burden of proof in general, and it's consistent with it. That whoever is making a positive claim that someone did something, that you own something, that you have a right to something, or whatever it is, that they have to demonstrate it, and the person who is operating in the negative does not have to prove anything. A good example is, say, I own that crayon. Can you prove it? The person is saying, no, you don't own that crayon, doesn't have to prove anything. The person is saying, yes, I do, does. Now, with this in mind, the burden of proof is on the government, because the government's mere existence makes a crap ton of positive claims. The first one being that you owe a percentage of your income, of your assets, of your wealth to the government in the form of taxation. Another claim that you are obligated to comply with our arbitrary edicts called legislation. And I'm pretty sure you can think of several other ones off the top of your head. The point is that they make all of these claims, and yet so far, they have failed to demonstrate any of them. They certainly may try to make some excuse in the form of the social contract, but I never signed a social contract, I never voluntarily consented, and whatever excuse they try to make to try to get around this, of like tacit consent, of passive consent, any contract lawyer will tell you that passive consent and tacit consent is just fraud, it's contract fraud, and any contract signed in such a way is at best forgery, and at worst, completely worthless and illegitimate. You don't sign a mortgage because you drove by the bank and accidentally made eye contact with the banker. That's absolutely ridiculous. So, with this in mind, the government has completely failed to demonstrate that they have any positive obligation onto me. So, as such, logic dictates, I must default to being an anarchist. Until such a time that a statist is able to demonstrate to me that the government has a right to tax me, to oppress me, to otherwise victimize me, I will remain an anarchist. If they can do so without appealing to circular reasoning or any other form of logical fallacy, I will become a statist right then and there. But personally, I'm not going to be holding my breath.
Thank you. Are there any social medias where people can find you?
You can most often find me on Discord, though since probably not going to be able to get a hold of me there, people who are viewing this. You can also find my content and my friend Esso's content on our YouTube channel at Back Alley Philosophy. Go and check it out. We make a whole bunch of really excellent content.